Hello everyone and welcome back to another introductory psychology video. Took a brief hiatus from making these, but we're back and today we're going to talk about chapter 7, which is all about intelligence and language. Let's get started. Well, if we're going to learn about intelligence, we should probably start with defining it, and it might be good to know this term thinking too. What is thinking? Well, thinking is essentially just paying attention to information, tossing it around in your head, and making conscious choices related to it. Intelligence, on the other hand, is generally defined as our mental capabilities for reasoning, for problem solving, thinking abstractly, learning from experiences, stuff like that. So now that we know that intelligence is generally defined as our mental capabilities or capacity, how do we measure it? Well, there were two French psychologists by the name of Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon, and they invented what's known as the IQ, the intelligence quotient, and it is a way to measure intelligence. And the way that it works, since it's quotient, that means there's going to be some division here. You measure the IQ by taking somebody's mental age, dividing it by their chronological age, and multiplying it by 100. Now what are these two terms here? Let's go ahead and define them. On the bottom here, the chronological age, very easy to understand, that's just how old you are. If you are 10 years old, your chronological age is 10, right? Very easy. Mental age, on the other hand, this is calculated by taking the IQ test. The mental age is essentially the intellectual functioning of the child, regardless of their chronological age. So for example, let's say you take a really smart 8-year-old. Their chronological age would be 8, but then they take this IQ test and they perform very well. And they're actually performing intellectual functions of a 13-year-old. So their mental age would be 13. So if we were to then find this child's IQ, we would divide 13 over 8, multiply it by 100, and we would find out that this child has a very gifted IQ of 137.5. That's very, very smart. Now when we're looking at IQ scores, there is a scale that is generally used to measure the giftedness of somebody, meaning the level of their mental capacities. And generally, if you score 130 or higher, you're considered extremely gifted. On the other hand, if you score 70 or lower, you're considered intellectually disabled. People at this level may need a little bit of assistance getting by in their day-to-day lives. But it's important to remember, regardless if you are somebody that got 130 IQ and you're gifted and you're a genius, or you're somebody that got a 70 IQ and needs a little bit of extra help in life, they all have the same inherent value as human beings, and they should all be treated with dignity and respect. It's important to note that although IQ is pretty much the standard way of measuring intelligence, at least here in the United States, it is not without some controversy. And the reason behind that is IQ tests do not necessarily take into account cultural differences between people. Meaning, if you grow up in, let's say, the Western Hemisphere, and the culture in the Western Hemisphere is accustomed to thinking about and learning about things in a certain way, if you were to then write a test based off of that type of understanding and give it to somebody from the Eastern Hemisphere who maybe thinks differently and solves problems differently, they might not do as well on the test just because they have a different way of thinking about problems. But that doesn't mean that they're any less intelligent. And this is some of the pushback that the IQ tests get. Now, there are different types of IQ tests out there. There's the one that was created by Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon, but there's another one created by a psychologist named David Wexler, who tried to capture the nuances of intelligence a little bit more. Using the Wexler scale, he was able to kind of calculate intelligences in different types. You can find IQs, for example, for verbal intelligence versus performance intelligence. Okay, now that we've learned a little bit about IQ, we'll go back to something that David Wexler kind of hinted at, which is these ideas of different types of intelligences. We learned in class that there was a man named Howard Gardner who proposed that there are actually 8 different types of intelligences that we can all have different strengths and weaknesses in. He proposed them to be linguistic, logical, mathematical, spatial, bodily, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalist. These are all different areas that we can have varying degrees of success in when it comes to our intelligence. Now at the bottom here, naturalist, has some controversy in its own right. There's some pushback because of a belief that is more just an interest rather than a preferred method of learning, but we won't go too far down that rabbit hole. It'll suffice to say that these are just Gardner's 8 types of intelligences. So in addition to Gardner's 8 different types of intelligence, there are other theorists who have proposed their own forms and their own takes on intelligence. There's a man by the name of Robert Sternberg who came up with the triarchic theory of intelligence. And he broke it down into just 3 categories. There's analytical intelligence, which is more based on mathematics, academic ability, stuff like that. Creative intelligence, which is related to creativity and insight. And practical intelligence, which we commonly refer to as street smarts. Gardner has 8 different types of intelligence. Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence states that there's just 3. There might be more than that, there might be less, who knows. That is what's beautiful about this field of psychology, is that it is ever developing and there's always new theories and ideas coming out. Now we'll shift gears a little bit now and talk about language, because we did talk about that a little bit in class too. And we learned that language is essentially just the communication of information and ideas, either through symbols or sounds that generally adhere to some rules of grammar. Now we were learning about language in the context of childhood development, and we learned about the different stages of language development in children, and a couple of the key ones that we talked about were hollow phrase and telegraphic. Hollow phrase is essentially when a child is first learning a language, they'll try to communicate sentences or ideas using just one word. If a child, for example, points at their mom and says, "Mom," that might be because they want their mom to come over to them, they're just excited to see their mom, or they're trying to get their mom's attention, for whatever reason. But the idea is generally just using one word to communicate something that would typically require more than one word. On the other hand, telegraphic is the next stage. It is just using 2 words to communicate a more complex sentence. If a child says, "play ball," that might be because they see their ball that they want to play with, and they're excited, or they're telling somebody, "I want to play with the ball, throw it to me," things like that. Hollow phrase is using 1 word to communicate. Telegraphic is using 2 words to communicate. Now, when we were talking about language development in children, it was only natural to talk about how language is actually acquired as we grow up, and we learned that there are essentially 2 schools of thought that theorize about how this works. There are the nativist theorists and the psycholinguistic theorists. Nativist theorists believe that there is something called a language acquisition device within our brains that essentially makes language development innate within all of us. They argue that there's a sort of universality across all languages all over the world, and that we all generally use the same rules and structures to communicate with each other, and so therefore there must be something innate within us that causes us to develop our language skills. Psycholinguistic, on the other hand, kind of takes the nativist theory one step further. They say that the capacity to learn language is innate within all of us, but it is through our interactions with the environment that we actually get the tools that we need to start learning how to speak and communicate with each other. This is why it's important for parents and guardians to talk to their babies as they're growing up, so they get used to the sounds and begin learning what they mean, and then they can eventually speak them on their own. Well, that's about all we learned for Chapter 7. I hope you enjoyed learning some more information about language and intelligence. I know I certainly did. Next week we're going to be doing a combined chapter. It'll be chapters 8 and 10, and it'll cover things from motivation to emotions to our personalities. It's going to be super interesting stuff. But for now, I think it's time for me to start making some minty pea soup. And I'm excited to give that one a try and see how it tastes. I'll be sure to let you know how it goes in the next video. I'll see you next time.